Good morning. Uh, Happy Memorial Day weekend. For those of you who are serving or have served in our armed forces, or have family members who have served or are serving, I just want to say thank you so much for your service. This weekend is a great opportunity to commemorate you and your service and service to our country and all the great things that are provided for us through that service. Just a couple more reminders before we get started. They were mentioned before, I think, and during announcements. Just keep them at the top of your mind. One, no Bible study tonight because it's Memorial Day weekend, but we've been having a great study through the book of Acts. So Wednesday night we'll pick that back up. We're in the 8th chapter of Acts. So it's always a good time to jump in at any point. Also, our clothing drive has gone better than I expected. Thank you all so much for all those who have donated clothes. Today is the last day for us to collect those. I think as we move into the summer, we'll be start collecting school supplies for the upcoming year. So I'll be looking forward to that. But before we get started, let's go to God in prayer. God, thank you so much for opportunities to remember good things in our lives. Remember the way you have worked. Remember your sacrifice for us. Thank you for times to remember the not so good things. Even though there are tragedies in our life, there are difficult times, we can hold on to that sacrifice that you made. We can hold on to it for strength and for hope and for comfort, knowing that those bad times that we have here on earth are temporary and that we have eternity waiting for us. We thank you so much for loving us and always providing for us and sending your Son into this world to die for us. It's in your name I pray. Amen. On May 18th, 1915, John Robert Fox was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. He attended Wilberforce University, an historically black university in Greene County, Ohio, where he participated in ROTC. He graduated in 1940, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. He graduated from infantry training at Fort Benning in 1941, and he was stationed at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, until he was deployed to the European front of World War II. In September of 1944, Italy had surrendered to the Allies. But there were still many Italian units that were loyal to the Germans remaining in the country. With the hope of pushing the Allied troops out of Italy and giving support to the Italians, the Germans launched a counteroffensive called Operation Winter Storm. By December of 1944, German and Italian battalions were prepared to stage a major offensive in the northern mountainous region of Italy called Garfagnana. High in the Apennine Mountains lay the small village of Somocolonia, where John Robert Fox and the 366th Infantry Regiment were stationed in preparation for the Axis assault. Fox was part of a forward observer unit that was responsible for directing artillery and mortar fire onto enemy targets. His platoon set up on the second floor of a house within the village to scout targets for the upcoming battle. On Christmas Day, German soldiers, posing as Italians in civilian clothing, began infiltrating the town of Somocolonia. In the middle of the night, German soldiers outside of the village sent a barrage of artillery shells into the Ally-occupied village. And then the disguised Germans, the ones disguised as civilians, they joined in the fight. And suddenly, the Americans were outnumbered 6-1. Immediately, the American forces retreated outside of the town. But Lieutenant Fox and his platoon decided to remain in their second-story outpost and try to direct artillery strikes against the incoming Germans. Wherever the invaders moved, he would radio in adjustments to the Allied artillery teams. He continued calling in adjustments until noon of the next day, December 26th. Each adjustment came closer and closer to their position as the German forces advanced, until finally the Germans were right on top of them. In his last transmission, he called on the artillery team to send in a strike directly where he was positioned. When the artillery team realized what John Robert Fox was asking them to do, they refused. But Fox replied, "Fire it." And because of Lieutenant John Robert Fox's heroic actions, in the face of tremendous opposition, the Axis forces were halted. When the rubble was cleared, the Allied soldiers found Fox's body among 100 dead German soldiers. Lieutenant Fox offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice to the cause of stopping the German advance. He sacrificed everything so the rest of his battalion could go on fighting. His story of sacrifice is a shining example of what it means to sacrifice your life for the good of others. It's a shining example of what we commemorate on Memorial Day. Sacrifice is the chief duty of the disciple. It's the highest call we're called to undertake. The one we follow, the one we are working to become, came into this world to be sacrificed. That was his primary goal, to die on the cross. Anyone who wants to be like him must also take up their cross and sacrifice their self as well. To take up your cross is to lay down your life. Lay down your comfort. Lay down your safety. Lay down your worldly desires, your ambitions, for the sake of Christ and His kingdom. Sacrifice is something that we must be intentional about doing if we're going to grow spiritually. We're in the middle of a sermon series on spiritual disciplines. And this morning, we're going to be talking about the spiritual discipline of sacrifice. If you've missed over the last few weeks, or if this is the first time you've been in here in a while, our sermon series, we've been calling this "Let Go and Let God," because we've been talking about spiritual disciplines of release, disciplines that require us to let go of something. That's why we've been calling it "Let Go and Let God." When we let go of something, God is able to work within us. Let go of what you have been holding on to and let God take control and shape you into the image of His Son. That's what a spiritual discipline is. It's something that moves us closer to Christ's likeness, closer to being in the image of Christ. And the ultimate example of being like Jesus is sacrifice. Jesus was a living sacrifice. He sacrificed himself on the cross. And so there is no higher calling for us as Christians than to be like him and to sacrifice ourselves as well. Sacrificing yourself requires that you let go of your need for security. Instinctually, we crave security. We live in a dangerous and unpredictable world. Bad things lie around every corner. And there are all kinds of things that scare us, that frighten us. But we all have basic fears that drive the things that we do. Fears like being unloved or losing your identity. Fears like being useless or deprived of freedom. These basic fears that we have cause us to shrink back. They cause us to hunker down, to batten down the hatches and just weather out the storm. Fears cause us to build a safe fortress for ourselves, where we can't get hurt, nobody can get to us, and nothing bad will happen to us. But the problem, when we put up walls and we stay in our camps and we never venture out into the dark unknown, is that we miss out on the adventure. We miss out on the high calling that God is calling us to. When we let our fears control us and keep us locked up behind the castle walls, we miss out on participating in the battle for the kingdom that God is fighting. We miss out on the abundant life that God has in store for us, and we miss out on spiritual growth. One of my favorite book series and movie franchises is The Lord of the Rings. If you've never seen the movies or read the books, the main characters are creatures called hobbits. And they're creatures who love comfort. They love normalcy. They hate anything that's abnormal or would require them to leave their comfort zone. They live in hovels in the sides of hills in a place called the Shire. Their hovels are safe underground bunkers, and the Shire is a secluded, peaceful place where nothing dangerous ever happens. Hobbits, they like their routines. They eat 6 meals a day. They do not move unnecessarily fast. They are suspicious of people and other creatures who live outside of the Shire. And they're extremely averse to any sort of adventure. But one day, Gandalf the wizard, he comes to the Shire to call Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, to an adventure. Bilbo resisted at first. But the marvel of adventure that Gandalf was calling him to was too strong to ignore. And Bilbo was whisked away into the perilous world to undertake the mission bestowed upon him. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door, Bilbo used to tell his nephew on numerous occasions. It's a dangerous business indeed. But it is what we are called to go outside of our camp, outside of our camp of security into danger. Out of the comfort of the light into the darkness. Out of the city of the world that we can see into the world that we can't see, the unknown. That is what the author of Hebrews said at Hebrews chapter 13, verses 9 through 16. It was typical for writers in the New Testament to end their letters with what's called paranesis. Paranesis is wise counsel, wise advice. And chapter 13 of Hebrews, what we'll be reading today, is paranesis. The writer is giving his readers some wise advice, some wise counsel. He's answering the question, how should we live as Christians? And so let's read that together. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Hebrews chapter 13. We'll be reading verses 9 through 16. And it'll also be on the screen behind me for you to follow along. In these verses, the Hebrew writer says that we should live our lives as Christians as lives of sacrifice. This is what he says. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. It's good for our hearts to be strengthened by grace, not ceremonial foods, which are of no value to those who eat them. We are an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. The high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that confess his name. And do not forget to do good and share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Now, this section of wise advice is about sacrifices that God is pleased with, compared to sacrifices that God is not pleased with. Here, the writer harkens back to the prophet Hosea, who said that it was mercy that God desired, not sacrifice. It's the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings that were burned on the altar. Jesus, in his ministry, he repeatedly echoed this statement to the Jewish religious leaders, that it is mercy that God desires, not sacrifice. One time, Jesus was in a field with his disciples, and they were hungry. They didn't have anything to eat, and so he took some grain from the edge of a field, and he rolled the grain in his hand to get out some kernels. According to Mosaic law, the edge of a field was reserved for the poor. Farmers were instructed to not harvest the edge of the field so that the poor could come and have something to eat. And that is exactly what Jesus and his disciples did. He rolled the grain in his hands to get the kernels out, to have something to eat. But the problem was that it was the Sabbath day. And the Jewish religious leaders admonished him for threshing wheat on the Sabbath. He was doing work on the Sabbath by getting the grain out for himself. They were more concerned about the letter of the law than the fact that there were people who were hungry. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It is much more important to offer mercy and grace to someone than it is to blindly follow legalistic rules. Another time, Jesus was spending time with tax collectors and sinners, and again, he was admonished by the Jewish religious leaders for spending time with such people. Again, Jesus responded, it isn't the healthy that need a doctor, it's the sick. He told them, go learn what it means that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. And so the writer of Hebrews, he fleshes this out a little bit for us about what it means that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. The Jews offered sacrifices in the temple. They would bring animals into the temple, and those animals would be an atoning sacrifice for their sins. They would also practice asceticism, denying themselves their physical needs. They would practice asceticism to obtain righteousness for themselves. However, the sacrifice that God approves of is a sacrifice of mercy, a sacrifice that offers grace, self-sacrifice, like the sacrifice of Christ. The sacrifice that God approves of is not asceticism for the sake of self-righteousness, denying yourself something to appear righteous to others. That was the sacrifice offered by the Jewish religious leaders. To them, denying yourself food on the Sabbath, if you had to thresh the grain yourself that day, was good. You should deny yourself. You should starve yourself if you're going to have to work on the Sabbath. Because in their mind, they were doing what God commanded. And that is what made them holy. That was their concern, to appear holy. They were not concerned at all about why God gave man the Sabbath at all. God gave man the Sabbath as a gift for rest and relaxation and to recharge after a week of hard work. God did not give man the Sabbath as a yoke to bear that would cause them an unnecessary burden. The Jewish religious leaders had all these rules about what constituted work on the Sabbath and what did not. But in doing so, they completely ignored the point that it was given. How is it relaxing if you have to starve yourself on the Sabbath? How is it refreshing to the soul if you have to count the number of steps that you take so that you don't work? Starving yourself on the Sabbath in order to appear holy is not the sacrifice that God approves of. And so the writer of Hebrews, he started off this piece of advice by counseling his readers to not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. In virtually every world religion, every philosophical worldview throughout history, and even today, there are dietary restrictions. Things that you cannot eat, things you cannot drink. There are restrictions on things you can and cannot do at certain times of the year. These are the strange teachings that he was referring to. Buddhists, for example, they're guided by the principle of do no harm. It's a good principle to live by, do no harm. But what this causes most Buddhists to be vegetarian, because they even want to do no harm to animals. They don't eat meat. Hindus, similarly, do not eat beef, because they believe that cows are the manifestation of a Hindu goddess, so they don't eat beef. In Islam and Judaism, pork is forbidden. Even in ancient Greek philosophy, asceticism was practiced. Denying yourself something in order to gain something in return. Socrates and Plato, they both advocated for the avoidance of self-indulgence and the pursuit of self-discipline. All of these religions, they also have certain times of the year, Ramadan in Islam, for instance, Diwali in Hinduism, where fasting and self-sacrifice in the form of asceticism is practiced. But the writer of Hebrews, he exhorted his readers to not be carried away by such teaching, by the teaching that it is ascetic practices that lead to righteousness. Instead, it is mercy and grace toward others that leads to righteousness. If you're going to sacrifice something in a way that helps someone else out. If you're going to deny yourself food through fasting, for instance, we'll actually talk about this more next week, about fasting in particular. But if you're going to fast, do it, but don't just not eat food because you think that it's going to make you holy in some way. Instead, give the food that you're denying yourself to someone else who's hungry. That is a sacrifice that God approves of. It's not the food that we eat that strengthens our heart. It's not even the denial of certain foods that strengthens our heart. It's grace that strengthens our heart. We're physically invigorated through the food that we eat, but we are spiritually invigorated through mercy and grace. The food that we eat does nothing for us spiritually, and neither does the food that we do not eat. That is not how we obtain righteousness. The only way that denying yourself anything will help you spiritually at all, will help you to grow spiritually, is if our self-sacrifice helps someone else in some way. Helps to meet someone else's need. And so if you are going to fast, do it. But take that food that you're denying yourself and give it to someone else who doesn't have any. The priests who served at the temple, they offered sacrifices on the altar to God. The priests were actually able to take a portion of the sacrifices for themselves as something to eat, as a meal for themselves. But the writer of Hebrews said that the sacrifices that we make as Christians are not for the priests to take a portion of. They're not animal sacrifices. They are sacrifices of service, charitable deeds for others. God does not desire us to sacrifice a bull or a goat to obtain righteousness. Our righteousness comes from actually being righteous, offering grace and mercy to those around us. Asceticism asks the question, what can I sacrifice? What can I give up to hopefully obtain righteousness for myself? That's the goal of ascetic practices in every religion. But Christian sacrifice asks the question, what can I sacrifice? What can I give up to share with someone else? It's the difference between trying to gain righteousness through religious actions versus being righteous by showing compassion to others. It's the difference between influencing God to grant forgiveness versus doing something in gratitude for the forgiveness that's already bestowed upon us. You see the difference? Worship at the temple involved the sacrifice of animals, but Christian worship, a sacrifice of praise, as the Hebrew writer put it, is laying down your own life for others in some way. In the same way that our Lord laid down his life for us. The writer of Hebrews went on to describe 3 ways that our sacrifices for others should be like Jesus's. Just like the priests, they would take the blood into the most holy place, but they would take the carcasses of the sacrifices outside of the city gate. Just like the priests did that, Jesus' body was also sacrificed outside the city gate. So in order for us to offer a sacrifice like Jesus' sacrifice, we too must also go outside the city gate. The writer actually used language that harkened back to the Israelites' time in the desert. When they were wandering through the desert, during that time there was no temple to offer sacrifices, and instead they had the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a portable tent that they were able to carry from place to place. They would set up camp in an area in the wilderness, and whenever they stopped, they would set up their camp in a specific way. The tabernacle would be in the middle, and there were 12 tribes of Israelites that would set up their camps around it. And so just as Jesus was outside the city gates when he was sacrificed, and so just like us, the Hebrew writer says, we ought to go outside the camp. He changed it. He changed his wording from city gates, referring to Jerusalem, to outside the camp, referring back to the time in the wilderness. And when they set up their camp with the tabernacle in the middle and each tribe setting up camp around it, that provided security. It provided safety. When the Israelites left Egypt, there was 600,000 men who all left Egypt at one time. That's not including women and children. And so in the wilderness, there's strength in numbers. There's safety and security in a group that large. Wild animals, they're going to avoid a mass of people that large. Other traveling nomadic people groups, they would avoid a group of people that large. And so when you are in your camp, you have safety, you have security. But if you go outside the camp, you're on your own. Your safety and your security will be in jeopardy. But in order to offer a Christ-like sacrifice, we must go outside the camp. We must leave our comfort zone, do things that threaten us, that scare us, that make us uncomfortable. Things that are hard and require a bit of courage. It isn't easy to go outside the camp, but that's what we're called to do. It isn't easy to move to the mission field in order to minister to those in far-off places. It isn't easy to volunteer to help kids with special needs. It isn't easy to start a prison ministry or a drug addiction ministry or to reach out to people of a different race or a different background. Those things are not easy. They're uncomfortable. But all of those things require us to step outside of our camp of security into danger. But that's the sacrifice that we're called to make. Stepping outside the camp, it's not only unsafe out there, it's also dark out there. It requires us to step out into the darkness. Inside the camp is the campfire. Inside the camp you have torches that light up the area where you're camping. In the light, there's safety. But when you're outside the camp, the light from the camp is no longer there. It's very dark outside the camp. And it's dark in the places that we're called to go. Death and divorce and sexual abuse and addiction, all those places are dark. The sacrifice that we're called to make as Christians is to go into the dark places of sin and bring God's light there. We are the light in the darkness. But how can we be a light in the darkness if we stay inside the camp where it's already lit up? We can't. We must leave the security of the light to go into the darkness. We must leave the comfort of the camp to go out into the dangerous world where it's dangerous and perilous. We must leave the city that we can see to go into the world that we cannot see. Where we are called to go, the adventure that God calls us to is an unknown world. We don't know what's going to happen. We could be putting our lives in danger. We could experience physical harm. There's no telling what might happen if we leave the camp and go out into the dark places of the world. We can't see what lies outside the camp. But isn't the entire point of our faith about an unknown, unseen world? The entirety of our faith rests in a place that we cannot see. We cannot see heaven, but we believe that it exists. We believe that because we've put our faith in Jesus, one day we will live there for all eternity. But so often, that about sums up our faith. Sitting and waiting until we get there. Sitting and just imagining how great it will be when we get there. This life, it's kind of like a waiting room. We sit and we wait until our name gets called, right? And in the meantime, while we're here, while we're in the waiting room, we try to make the waiting room as much as the place we're waiting for as possible. So we set up camp in the waiting room. We put up walls so nothing bad can happen, nothing scary can get in. We make a comfy little bed out of chairs there in the waiting room. We get lots of pillows and lots of blankets. We build our pillow fort there in the waiting room. We want it nice and as cozy as possible. And we just sit and we wait and we never leave. We certainly can do that with our time here on earth. But while we're setting up camp in this waiting room, not trying as hard as we can not to let anything bad come in, there's all kinds of people outside of our camp, out in the darkness, out in the unknown, who don't even know the waiting room exists. They're outside, and they need someone to help them to get inside. And the only way they're ever going to be able to get in is if we go out there and get them. But it requires us to go outside the camp. It requires us to let go of our need for security and to let go of our comfort and to go out into the dangerous darkness and sacrifice for them. That's our call. It's a high calling, but it is a grand adventure that God has prepared for us. And if we truly believe that He loves us, shouldn't we also believe that He will be right there with us the entire time? It's a dangerous business, walking out your door. But that is how we become like Christ. He sacrificed His life for us, and we ought to sacrifice ourselves for others, so that they may also know the grace that comes through that sacrifice. Well, we're going to sing one more song. And if you have never experienced the grace that comes through that sacrifice, the Bible tells us that all we need to do is put our faith and trust in Him and be baptized into His name. If that is a decision you want to make this morning, you're invited to come forward during this next song. Let's pray. God, we thank You so much for not staying in the camp. What better camp is there than heaven itself? Where it's comfortable, it's safe, it's secure, but You left Your camp to come into the dark world that we live in, to come get us. Thank You for coming to get us and dying on the cross for us. And I pray that You would give us the strength and the courage to do the same, to step outside of our